If you think that 12 columns is too limiting, then you have another great option, and that is to nest items inside of cells. So you can nest a cell inside of a cell, rows inside of a cell, or entire containers inside of cells. And so frequently for complex layouts, you may want to define some area, I'll call it a sub area, of your overall layout for some purpose, and you want to, inside of that sub area, you want to use that 12 column system for layout. Well, nesting is how you achieve that. And so any given cell can essentially define a new amount of horizontal space inside of which you can put another container, a row, or even individual cells. And so it will still follow the breakpoint rules that you create, but it will provide less overall horizontal width to function inside of. And we'll see some examples of that here. So let's go ahead and begin by creating a new HTML page called nesting.html. Nesting. And here we'll start with our typical template, but we're going to modify it dramatically because we're going to change out the styling. I'm going to get rid of the cell style, and I'm going to add 3 cells just so we can easily distinguish what's on the inside and what's on the outside. And so I have this outer class I've created and an inner class, and they're just 2 different colors of blue, and this border in the inner class. And then I also added this outline, which would allow us to see some dashed red outlines so we can specify the thing that we want to focus on. I think that I found that helpful. And so let's go ahead and let's get rid of this single row that we have inside of our container. And inside of here, what I want to do is start off, I'm going to actually just paste in code so it doesn't take time to type all this out by hand, but you certainly could take a few moments and do this if you like. All right. So here we go. You can see here that I've defined a row, and inside of that row I have 2 cells. A cell that will be 8 pixels. In fact, I got this as small. Let's go extra small for these, and it'll apply no matter what. So extra small 8 and an extra small 4. All right, and inside of the extra small 8, I have added a nested row. So I've created another div tag inside of this outer call XS8 with the row class, and inside of that just added 3 additional cells, each of them 3 columns in width with an offset of 2 on the first column. Okay, so that's the structure. We have a row with 2 cells. In the larger of the 2 cells, we have another row embedded inside of it with 3 cells inside, taking up the full, I guess 11 of the 12 possible columns inside of that row. So let's see how that looks. Okay, and so you can see, first of all, here we have the regular cell taking up 4 columns, and the first cell taking up 8 columns. Inside of that first cell, I've defined a row. And notice the borders of that row go from one boundary of the cell to the other boundary of the cell, from side to side. This inner row, this nested row, also has an offset of 2 with 3 cells defined, each of which are 3 columns wide. Now notice that this column is defined as 3, our cell rather is defined as 3 columns, but it's considerably smaller than the 4 columns here in the regular cell. Why? Because now we're working only inside of the boundary of this red area here, and we divvy up its internal width into 12 columns, and then utilize those columns as the widths for the given cells. Okay, so that is one example that I have. Let's look at a variation on that idea here. And it's almost identical, but this time what I'm doing is going to switch, and again I'll switch this to extra small just so it works at all resolutions. And so this time the cell that contains the nested row will actually be half of the original size. So we should see these inner the inner row and its cells should be even smaller in terms of width. And so let's go ahead and run this again. Okay. And you can see this is just a minified version, a half width version of the one above it, because the row that we're nesting inside of the cell, its available area has been cut in half because we're only allowing 4 columns for the outer row because the other regular cell is taking up 8 columns. All right. So I want you to compare that now with using or embedding rather an entire container inside of a given cell. Basically the same approach, except instead of just a single row, we're going to put the entire container inside, and I've added the outline, that red dash, so that we can see the boundary of the new container. And we're back to the, let's go extra small on the outermost cells of that row, and let's run it. Okay, and compare what we have here. Now let's compare this first row versus this third row. And you can see that inside of the container, there is less horizontal space than in the row. Why is that? Well, because we didn't use a fluid container. We used a fixed width container, right? And so it's going to have some margin on the left and the right. So that's why we see that extra space there. However, I would point out though that there's more vertical space allocated to the container than there was to the row. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. All right, and so we can put a container inside of a cell. And let's take another look at another example. All right, so this time we have a row with 2 cells. The first cell is 4 columns wide. The second cell is 8 columns wide. And inside of that column, the first cell, I've added another cell. It is only 3 columns wide, and I'm added an offset of 8. All right, so let's see what that looks like. All right, so again, here we are inside of this, and this entire cell is 4 columns for its row, and then it's the inner cell inside of that is 3 columns of all its available width, and it has a margin of what, 8? Of 8 columns. Again, 8 columns relative to the width of the cell that it's nested inside of. And just as a last example, let's just, for the sake of comparison, take that last example that we just created, copy it, and paste it in, and then we'll just switch these around so we can compare widths and do the same thing. All right, so now we're looking at these final 2 here. I should have added a little more space down there. But you can see that now instead of 4 columns for the outermost cell, there's 8 columns for the outermost cell. That makes the inner cell about double the width of the previous cell. But still, it's only working within the boundaries of that cell itself. So in order to achieve some interesting effects, we can use nesting, whether at the cell level, the row level, or even the container level. And it's just something that we can play around with and to get the desired effect. All right, so let's keep looking at additional classes that will help us to modify layout. We'll keep going in the next lesson. See you there. Thanks.